All right, everybody. So this is Unit 4, Section 7, Forms of Governance. And so we're really just kind of looking at two different types in this. We're looking at something called a federal system and a unitary system. And so those are the two big concepts today. I'll get a little typo down here. But those are two big concepts. And so knowing what they are and then the advantages and disadvantages, that's the gist of it today. So uh, the two types of governance, and this is for a state as in a country. The two types of government systems are either, again, unitary or federal. And so, just in short, and then we'll get into a little bit more detail in just a second. A unitary state has a very strong central government. And so, it doesn't have like a state government like the US has. We have a federal and then a state and then local. This just has one big national government that pretty much runs the city. There's some local governments that just implement the policy of the national government. So this says power is concentrated in a national assembly inside a national city. So federal states, like we have a decentralized government, meaning we have the federal government does some, uh, the state governments do some, and then local governments do a little bit. So that's kind of the difference. So let's take a look, and we'll get into obviously some more specifics here shortly. So these are all the around the world. Countries are going to be one of the two, either unitary or federal. So as you can see, the U.S. here is federal, Canada's federal, Russia's federal, India's federal, China is unitary. A lot of the countries in Africa are unitary. A lot of the countries in Western Europe are unitary. And so you kind of get the idea. It's spread, and there's reasons that a country might have one versus the other. But before we do that, I do want to kind of show. Well, I'll show you in just a little bit. So when we look at a unitary state, okay, we have the big central government here, and then we have all of the small local governments which carry out the policies. Okay, this would be like if our state government didn't exist and we allowed Washington D.C. to write all the laws, and then just the local governments just did what the federal government told them, not federal, the national government told them to do. So here's just a couple of the characteristics here. So uh, central government makes all the laws. The laws and policies are applied uniformly throughout the country, meaning whatever is good for this city has to follow it, and this city has to follow it. And so there's no one city's not doing one thing while another city's doing another. The central government can create or abolish local governments, and so they could say, look, we are abolishing you. You're going to kind of become part of this local government, or they could say, look, let's make a new city over here. So that's one of their powers. Our government can't do that. Our federal government, and so then the last one: central governments provide many public services such as healthcare, public schools, roads, you name it, police force, stuff like that. And so uh, there are two characteristics in general that would lend a country to be more to follow a unitary system instead of a federal system. So those two are the country's population is homogenous, meaning that the culture is very similar throughout the country, or the country is very geographically small. All right. Now, some of the examples here: the UK, France, China. You saw the map earlier. There's a whole bunch of them, and I'll show you a list in just a second. Obviously, China does not fall in this geographically small part. And there are, some different ethnicities for sure within China. So there's always exceptions to rules, but you get the idea. Here's a list of all of the unitary republics. All right, there's a bunch of them. You don't need to memorize any of these, but so let's take a look real quick at some of the positive and negative impacts. So again, we have a national government that is making the law for everybody within the country, and there's no differentiation between one place and another. All right, and so we have standardization. So these are the positive impacts. And by the way, this was just pulled from this list was pulled from an FRQ, the scoring guidelines, and so this is kind of what AP would be looking for. But these are all legit. Positive impact, standardization of the laws and their implementation across the country. And so, for one thing, in a unitary system, everybody has to follow the same law, and within that, there won't, the one place won't be looking at it, won't be carrying it out in a different way than another. All right. And so, when our federal government in the U.S. passes a law, you might see states carrying it out differently because their interpretation may differ, and they may try and kind of tweak it and implement it to more suit their needs. But In a unitary system, they are all carried out in a standard way across the country. Patriotism and pride, because there is this uniformity, can occur. All right. Efficiencies are achieved through less duplication or a faster countrywide implementation of laws. And so, if in the U.S. we have the federal government here, the state government here, and then the local government here. Sometimes you might end up with all three of these levels trying to do one thing, and that creates some inefficiency. All right. And so you might be more efficient. There's other reasons that it would be less efficient. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then fewer government or taxation agencies. We have the IRS for the federal government here, and we have the state, and we have a lot of different taxes throughout the state, and then we have the local. We have a lot of local taxes that we have to pay, and so you just kind of cut down on that with the unitary system. The potential for corruption of local government is reduced, all right, because all the decisions, the powers decided in the national government, and so the potential for corruption that is impactful on people's lives is reduced. It's not nothing by any stretch, but it is reduced. And then finally, we have what happened there? Sorry. Then we have creation of national identity that reduces the potential for devolutionary processes. And so, if you have a country and everybody's on the same page doing the same thing, all the laws are the same, this idea of devolution is going to be much lessened, because remember, devolution is saying, hey, this group wants some more power, and so if everybody's doing the same thing, that is possibly lessened. All right, and again, all of these are centripetal forces. And note, this says is not worthy of a point. And again, I pulled this from a grading rubric, but these are all centripetal forces. These are all things that will bind a group together. Right. And so then we have negative impacts. And so negative impacts that would pull people apart be centrifugal force. All right. So centralization of power can lead to a disconnect with local areas. And so imagine we have, this country here. Let's say this is the U.S. All right. So Washington, D.C. is here. Arizona is here. And especially before technology, is there a bit of a loss? Is there a disconnect between Washington, D.C. and places farther off? And that's one of the concerns. It can lead to a disconnect with local areas, minority groups, regional political parties, disparate regions. And so, this distance, if there's one subgroup here, they may not be heard, right? And so marginalization of local culture, marginalization just means we're not going to pay as much attention to it. They become kind of outcasts. It's the same because it's more uniform. You get local cultures that are being dismissed a bit. Central government may not, effectively provide services on a subnational scale. If we have a problem here in Tucson, would you rather the government in Tucson in the state of Arizona be ready to take care of it, or the national government? Because the government of Tucson is going to be much more responsive to problems within Tucson than the national government would. Decisions and policies of central government could become dominated by interests of the politically or culturally dominant group. And this can happen in both types, but think of it like this. You've got a group of people in national power. If you're a special interest group and you want to influence the government to do something for you, then it's easier to influence one national government, there, instead of all 50 governments and then the national government as well, like in a federal system. And so you do tend to get, it could tend to become easier to influence the people within the national government and have a broad impact. All right. And then finally, central government can get bogged down by competing local problems or slow response to local issues. And so, again, if we have a natural disaster, infrastructure problems, public services, if we have a problem with our education system, Tucson and the state of Arizona are much quicker to deal with it than Washington, D.C. would be. All right. So that's that part. Then we have the federal states. And so the federal system says, look, we have this one government, one national government up top, but we also have state governments here. All right. And then, so it's the state there. And then we have local down here. And so let me show you, and this is why this is a kind of a cool system. So imagine that this circle represents power, right? And so if we have a unitary system, you have the local people down here. They would have some power, not a whole lot, but then the central government up here would have all of it. And so the way that we do it and the way other federal systems do it, we say, look, the federal government, you guys have half the power, roughly. The state, you guys have almost half the power, and local, you guys have some. And so then they said, look, sorry, let's break this down even further and break up the power in the federal. And so we have the president and the executive branch. We have a legislative branch, that's the House of Representatives and Senate. Uh, and then we have the judicial system, that's the courts. And so the legislative branch, they make the law. The executive branch, the president, enforces the law, and then the judicial branch interprets the law. And so the power of the federal government is broken up among these three groups called separation of powers. And then within the states themselves, we have an executive branch, which is the governor. We have a legislature within Arizona. I mean, all states do. Generally, it's the House and Senate again. And we also have a Supreme Court within the states. And so you can see that power is diverse, right? Power is spread out. And so if you get one group in here who wants to, mess with the system, you have all these others that can block that. And so the big example, obviously, the last election, it was President Trump certainly tried to challenge it, and he was given that ability within the courts. He brought 60 court cases into the states. Okay, and so he's going to the states, and he had every right to present the evidence. But the judges in all those states, I think there was one case that he won, but the rest of them were thrown out. And so if he's trying to get things overturned, and you can argue whether you think he was trying to overturn the election or not, but the states really stood up and said, look, we run the elections. That's one of the state powers. And they said, the state of Georgia, they were pressured to manipulate some things possibly. And so the state of Georgia said, that's not how we're doing this. The governor and the secretary of state within Georgia who ran the election said our election was fair and legit. And they're the same party as the president. So, when you have a power grab by any one of these, there's a whole bunch of others that are lined up against it to stop stuff from happening. So that's one of the neat things about the federal system and having all of this division of power. Not one person or entity has complete power, and there are other things built in to stop that, to stop an individual or group from gaining all the power. So anyway, that said, so the federal government shares political power. So here's the federal, here's the state. So these would be federal powers, here's state powers. And then there are some in between, like education, not education, I'm sorry, policing and taxing and things like that. So they do share some powers, but central government makes some laws. Most laws are passed at the state level. Just to give you a sense here, out of all the court cases, 95% are held at the state level, 5% at the federal level. So most of the laws that we live by are state laws. Laws and policies do differ between jurisdictions. And so think about what Arizona did just recently. They made recreational marijuana legal. And so it's legal in Arizona now, but if you went up to Utah, I believe Utah doesn't have it legal. So, we have different areas. And then the federal government, they actually have, and here's the irony, it's illegal with the federal government to have marijuana be legal in a state. And so the federal government could actually come and shut all this stuff down if they chose, because federal law is supreme. Federal law always wins if there's conflict. But so we do have different laws between different states. And this can be good because, people are different within each state. Some states may have more relaxed gun control. Some states may have tighter gun control. So it just depends. All right. Sorry. And then local governments, they're the ones who provide the public services. So if we look at, education, local governments, they're the ones who really actually do the supplying of education. It's half funded by the local government and half funded by the state. So anyway, and then finally, central governments can't create or abolish local government units. So here's a quote from Alexander Hamilton, who became popular after the play. And so You can read this. You can pause it and read it if you want. But he's saying that the states are going to retain power. Okay, and so what are the characteristics of countries that would use a federal system when their population is heterogeneous and they are geographically large? And this certainly fits for the U.S. Both of those apply. So the U.S., Canada, Australia, those are all examples. So let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages. Then we're done. So the advantages are, and this is one of the big ones, there's local autonomy, and autonomy is you can make the decisions for yourself, but we also have national unity. And so let's take, the U.S. here. That's not a good U.S., but so here's Tucson, and we can do our own thing in Tucson, and they can do their own thing in New York, and we can be very different, but is there national unity? All right. And so we are going through more challenging political times, and we're not as unified as we most often are, but we are generally still a pretty unified country. All right. But this allows for cultural differences and subcultures to thrive. And then we leave, so the states and the local areas can do their thing, and we leave things like defense of the country, currency, to the national government. All right. And then the federal government, here's the other part about our system. The federal government can uphold national standards. And so think about, and we talked about this a little bit before, think about gay marriage. There's this constant battle between states' rights and individual rights, right? And so should gay marriage be legal? And this was decided in 2014. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4, so it wasn't, an overwhelming decision. Ruled 5-4 that it was. It probably wouldn't be legal with today's court. Okay, the court's changed. And so here's the argument. The people within the states say, look, marriage was a power given to the states, and so states should be allowed to decide that for themselves. Who should have a right to marry within the state. The other side says that there's an equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment that says people should be treated equally, and that by not allowing gay couples to get married, that is discriminatory and not treating people equally. And so, this is a states' rights versus, your individual rights as a U.S. citizen. And so this is an advantage and a detriment of a federal system. Okay, so the Supreme Court ruled that a state cannot deny gay marriage based on the 14th Amendment argument. But some people say, hey, look, states' rights, states should have a right to do this if they want. But anyway, got off tangent there. So division of power can promote efficiency. The federal government doesn't have to deal with regional issues. So if we have an issue here in Tucson, that the federal government doesn't need to get involved, and that's more efficient. Let the local people take care of the local problems. The federal government can take care of the big problems. People do tend to take more interest in local politics when they have more of a say, and that's true. If you think that the people in charge are the ones who are going to be taking care of it, that's certainly possible. All right, distribution of powers checks the potential despotism of the central government. That's this thing that I was talking about here. I'm having troubles today. There, all right. So it does provide a check on the power. And this one's pretty neat, the laboratories of democracy. Make sure you're good with this one. So laboratory of democracy. So we have 50 states in the U.S. And so let's say that we're trying to figure out how to deal with healthcare, right? And so one approach is to say, look, let's let the states figure this out. So we got 50 states. What if each state tried something a little bit different, on their own? They came up with their own plan. And so you might have one state that's saying, hey, we figured this out. Then the other states can look at them and say, you know what, that's a good idea. Let's try and do ours. And so we have all these different experiments happening. With right now, they're trying to figure out distribution of the vaccine. West Virginia has the best rate of vaccine distribution in the country. The Trump administration told the states, you guys figure this out. And so there's good and bad to that. And so West Virginia figured out a way to do it. And now other states are looking at them, and saying, okay, what did they do? And how can we implement that? And so the Biden administration's coming in, and they may make some changes, and they may look at what West Virginia did and, take some of their cues. So when we talk about a laboratory of democracy, again, you're turning over power to the states and saying, you guys try and figure it out. And if somebody comes up with something good, we can share it, and then everybody else can use it. So that's kind of a good thing. It's like one policy isn't going to fit all, but you know. Better supervision of state governments by the people. They are more accountable to us if they're local. And then local governments can react faster. All right, so those are all advantages. Some of the disadvantages, for sure, it does prevent the creation of national policy. All right, and so if we do want to create one policy for everybody, that gets tough. If you look at gun laws around the states, they are very different. And so that's just that's either a good or a bad. Depending on where you are politically. Sometimes you'll say, "Hey, states should be able to do it," and other times you're going to say, "Hey, government, the federal government should make a law," depending on which political party you're in and whatever the issue is. So it'll make you happy sometimes and sad other times. Possible lack of accountability if you have the federal, the state, and the local governments. Sometimes they will blame each other. The local government may say, "Hey, the state didn't do their part." The state government may say, "Well, the federal government didn't really help us out." Federal government may say, "Look, the local and state governments aren't doing what they're supposed to do." So possible lack of accountability. We do see this, and this is a weird one. In local elections, you might get 20% of the voters to turn out on a good day. In the last presidential election, I think it was something like 60%. And so we tend to turn out for the elections that have the least impact on us. Local laws are the ones that have the biggest impact on us, but we turn out at a far lower rate. It's weird. Next one, differing laws across the country. Think about marijuana laws today. We talked about that already. Redundancy in government. You might have too many government agencies trying to do the same thing. You might have the federal government. Let's take environmental stuff. The federal government might be doing an environmental thing. The state would have their own policy on whatever environmental thing it is. Then the local government may say, "Hey, we want to be part of this too. We're going to have our own regulations." And so you may end up with three groups trying to do the same thing, or they might end up working against each other if they disagree. Now, this one, make sure you put this one in your notes. Greater potential for devolutionary forces to take hold. If you allow states more power, the potential that they may want to, at some point, if things go really bad, break away and do their own thing, that is much more enhanced than in a unitary system. And it seems, kind of like a silly thing right now, but remember, we had a civil war. That is devolution, when the South said, "You know what, we're done, we're breaking away." And the only thing that held the country together was Abraham Lincoln and the Union winning the Civil War. And so, it's rare and it's an extreme case, and we're not there by any stretch right now, but you can certainly see in today's political climate how that might be more possible. How some states may say, "Look, we're done with the federal government. We want to start to break away." And so that can be a definite risk. Okay, so there's a lot of upsides to this, but that is definitely one of the bigger risks. And then finally, national policy can take a long time sometime to implement, to go from Washington, D.C. and reach all the way, all throughout the country. Alrighty, so that's it. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Y'all have a great day.